Good afternoon, everyone. This is Christina Tanaschuk, the executive editor of Homeland Security Today, talking with Bradley Hope, who has initiated and executed a podcast about the fall of Afghanistan and some of the experience of the Afghani people fleeing. We're really excited to have him. We worked with his project, Project Brazen, on some interviews from Ukraine, directly from the war. And so we're very excited to hear more of his work and certainly of Project Brazen and the types of stories they're bringing to the front with these podcasts. So welcome, Bradley.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Tell us a little bit more about how you got involved with Project Brazen, because you worked on the Ukraine podcast as well, correct?
That's right. Yeah. So Project Brazen is a new company that I founded with Tom Wright. We were longtime collaborators at the Wall Street Journal, focused on doing kind of the big stories in the newspaper for the front page. But we wanted to set out and kind of do something different, a little bit more innovative, and to really focus on the story, almost like the story can be like a movie launch. It exists by itself. It doesn't have to have, you don't find it through projectbrazen.com. We're not a newspaper. We're just kind of an independent producer of these very ambitious projects. That's kind of our idea. And the Ukraine project came out of like a moment of passion. We felt really strongly about what was happening in Ukraine, and we wanted to reflect those stories of resistance, even the small ones, the everyday life resistance. But whereas this Afghanistan project was something that took a lot longer, and it was a lot more developed in some ways, because that kicked off right after Afghanistan, after Kabul fell to the Taliban. We started that project, whereas Ukraine, we were doing it all within a month and a half. And I think, just like many people, I as a journalist, I've covered Afghanistan over the years. I used to be based in the Middle East career, and watching what had happened, it was almost just kind of surreal. And one thing that I was most inspired by, most struck by, was the stories of all this concept that most of the population of Afghanistan is actually born after 9/11, and they grew up in this era where they were exposed to these Western ideas about women's rights, around democracy, and kind of science over religion in some ways, things like that, and just how profoundly their lives changed when the Taliban just took over the country almost instantly. It felt, and we were also really struck. I mean, one of my experiences was I got to meet in my career this longtime CIA officer who I really respected and cared about his point of view, and I really listened to him about the story he felt and the pain he felt trying to rescue a translator he worked with a lot during his career in Afghanistan. And that was kind of the jumping off point for the project. And then what we've created over time is a kind of a tapestry of stories, almost all very Afghan forward, but there's a lot of other characters involved, people around the world trying to help people in Afghanistan. But it's actually, I think, a really eye-opening experience. And I was just traveling through Dallas recently. I live in London, and in the security area, there's a lot of Afghans where we're obviously hired to be like the greeters in the airport. As I was walking by, I thought to myself that probably the average American doesn't quite know what they've gone through to get where they are now. And that was my thought about, that's kind of the lasting impact we wanted to bring with this project.
Well, I think that's so important, particularly with all of the immigration challenges. I mean, the United States has challenges with immigration policy. They have different administrations having different attitudes towards immigration, and really telling these stories and helping people understand. I guess you called it a tapestry, and I mean, I'd really agree with that word, and just the texture of cultures and different people and different trains of thought. Just like in the United States, we have all kinds of people who think differently, and your insights into how this generation has been raised with a lot of Western influence, and how that can be impacted by our policy in the future. So you've really been in the middle of a lot of things. You covered Arab Spring from Cairo, and you were in Tripoli and Beirut. And so how was this one different?
I think, well, the one thing is, if you spend a lot of time covering stories from outside of your home country, you start to just develop a little bit more sensitivity in a way, because it's easy as a first-time foreign correspondent to be almost just sort of shocked by what feels quite exotic to you. It's very different than what you're used to. And I think at this point in time, having lived the majority of my life abroad, I'm always searching for the theme, like what connects me to this person, and what's similar about their experience and what's different, and to respect the difference and not think it's bad or a problem, you know. I have that experience a lot. You know, I spent a lot of time in Saudi Arabia, places like that, where some of the norms are very different. But on the other hand, family is so important. Like in Afghanistan, it's a very family-oriented society, and I think that's something that in America we can understand and connect with. That really matters a lot to people. Um, but yeah, so I would try to bring that sensitivity, but also the good thing about a podcast is it's really a team effort. You know, obviously I was involved, but there are so many people's creativity that was poured into the project, and we tried to embrace a kind of a diversity of backgrounds and experiences to help make sure that we really capture this experience. Because you know, obviously, I can connect with that CIA officer a lot easier, just naturally, because we speak the same kind of shorthand. But we wanted to be broader than that, and so we had an Afghan kind of co-producer who was helping us with translation. We had um, people on the ground in Kabul. We had people in different countries in the world doing a lot of the interviews, and we actually did a huge number of interviews, and we kind of winnowed them down for the show. But a lot of the other material we put on our website, kabulfollowing.com, just so we didn't feel like we wasted those people's times. So we try to use it in other ways. But um, and I think that it's the kind of the nice thing about podcasts. You can it's more of a team effort. You know, a lot of my career was in newspaper writing and book writing, and that's a little bit more of a solo effort. You know.
Absolutely. And so you say you did interviews all across the globe. How did you find the folks? Did they volunteer? Or tell us a little bit about the process of creating the podcast.
Yeah, I mean, we had this idea for the kind of structure we wanted to approach. There's actually a famous book called The Bridge of St. Louis Ray, written by this author, Thornton Wilder. And it's all about this and all the stories of the people that were affected by this bridge. And that was kind of in my head as we were starting to think about how to approach it. But we essentially just started very small. We had a handful of people that we had met that had interesting stories. We didn't even assume they would be in the show, but we interviewed them as if they would be. And then we asked at the end of every interview, there's a saying that I learned from the author Lawrence Wright, is you at the end of an interview you say, so who else should I talk to? You know, and so it kind of just exploded out. You know, you kept finding new people, and the stories that we actually loved the most was where we talked to one person and then we talked to like 3 or 4 other people about the same experience from different perspectives. So for example, there's this one, just probably the most incredible story in the whole podcast, is the story of this American Israeli journalist called Dana Harmon, who was actually on a very kind of fancy holiday in Venice when and she had covered Afghanistan, had covered the women's robotics team, and was sort of casually watching what was happening. But then she started getting these messages, and she just became consumed by the idea of helping initially a very small number of women, young women. But over time, it just started to grow and expand. And by the end, she and a network that she built were like almost remote controlling dozens and dozens of Afghans in multiple buses, different directions, trying to get them out of the country. And this was really post airport. They couldn't get to the airport. They tried and they couldn't get in. And so she remote controlled them over like WhatsApp and Signal messages into Tajikistan, and then did it again for another round after that. And we talked to many people from different points. We talked to the women on the bus. We talked to Dana. We talked to a journalist in Tajikistan who saw them arrive. You know, we tried to find all those different perspectives. And there's some really crazy stories in there about like at one point they didn't have passports, for example, the people on the bus. So they through connections they found the guy who was the outgoing ambassador of Afghanistan to Russia. He went to the embassy and just printed passports for all these people, and then getting them into Afghanistan so that they could travel out of Afghanistan. It was an enormous story, you know.
Yes, that whole piece is addictive. I know that from Ukraine. Once you start kind of helping and building those networks, you just want to keep going until people are out of harm's way. So that's amazing. So were any of the people that you talked to afraid to talk to you, or is everyone kind of settled and out?
Yeah, I think a lot of the people we talked to people in very different stages. We talked to a lot of people who are kind of in limbo. There's a lot of Afghans are still waiting to be arrive where they're headed. So there's a lot of these people, for example, in Abu Dhabi, there's this facility where they're just waiting and they have literally nothing to do. They're just sitting around. Those people are not in danger, so they feel safe. But with the people in Afghanistan were the ones that felt at most risk. And in the end, there was at least two people we couldn't even use in the podcast because at the last minute they just felt it was too risky. So I think it's those people that were facing the most risk talking to us. But we did have a correspondent who spent time in Afghanistan during the course of the recording of this podcast, and you'll see in episode 8, which is kind of a different structure than the other episodes. He actually went around Kabul on his bicycle and recorded everywhere he went, and he kind of did an audio diary because he was there at the airport on those crazy days, and he went back to that place, and it's actually very reflective, you know. But even him, you'll hear in the tape, he at one point he gets a bit nervous. He's like, I don't think it's safe. I have to leave. He quickly bicycles away, you know. So it's definitely not an easy place to work, and it's not safe for many Afghans to speak publicly with their name, you know.
Absolutely. That's one of the first things I thought of when we started talking about doing this interview, and certainly getting and featuring the podcast at HS Today. So, I know that Ukrainians are the same. We just had that the hush about a certain military operations, and everyone's saying, don't talk about anything on social media, don't talk about anything because you don't know who's listening. So I know why I would listen to this podcast, but why do you recommend this, that people listen to this and hear this podcast?
Yeah, what I would say is, in a way, I would almost not worry about it being about Afghanistan. It's really about people facing suddenly the biggest crisis of their lives, maybe even the biggest crisis of like their lives and their parents' lives. And what do they do in that moment? And how do they survive and facing that peril? So it really is it's like a universal story of resilience and heartbreak and hope and all those kinds of things. And we tried to really create a cinematic enveloping you in this world perspective. I mean, there's a kind of tension. You want to know what happens to the person that you're introduced to, and how do they end up, and what happens to them, you know. And I think so we really focus on the characters, the story, and we spend a lot of time on things like music and sound design to really make it bring you there, you know. So it's not a chore. It's not like a project where you're trying to catch up on the history of Afghanistan. It's really much more focused on that person that you see in that's an Afghan arrival in your hometown. This is what they went through. It's an amazing story that kind of reflects almost things like World War II, or when you speak to a Ukrainian, it's the same thing. What did they go through to end up where they are with you? And it's actually very inspiring, even if it is quite sad sometimes too.
Absolutely. Well, it makes the struggle very human, and it helps people understand. And like you said, we have that connection of family and just basic humanity. And it seems these podcasts bring that forward, because there's a lot of suffering happening right now. There's a lot of folks that have had to flee for one reason or another. And it just seems like humanity never gets to a stage where we get to take a break and not have these tragic things happen. So I want to thank you for your work, and certainly for working with Homeland Security today. We're thrilled to feature all of your podcasts related to our readers, and we'll be featuring Kabul Falling on our website and on our podcast page. So if you haven't visited the HS Today podcast page, we feature a lot of different types of communications and podcasts that address not only technical issues of Homeland Security, but also the human side. So Bradley, thank you so much for your work. It's very, very important. And I'm glad it sounds like you're having fun doing it while really bringing a piece of humanity to all of our hearts. So thank you for that.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.